Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing nobody in Trauma Bay 3 could explain. When the 18-year-old came in with a compound fracture so severe the bone had torn through the skin of his thigh, every resident in the room flinched. The attending looked away for half a second. The scrub tech stepped back, but Nurse Voss had already moved to the head of the bed, already calculated the bleed rate by sight, already started calling out what she needed before anyone thought to ask. Calm. That particular kind of calm that doesn't look practiced. The kind that looks like something else entirely. Like the person had learned it somewhere darker than a hospital. Nobody asked about that. Nobody asked about much when it came to Voss. She showed up, she went home, for 3 years at Brampton General. That was enough. Then it wasn't. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not to her locker, not to her email, to the nursing station in an envelope marked Private and Confidential, addressed to Claire Voss, RN, Trauma Unit, 3rd floor. The charge nurse, Daniels, held it out at arm's length like it might bite her. Voss opened it at the end of her shift, standing in the change room with her scrubs still on, her bag not yet unzipped. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in her back pocket. The letter was from the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Hargreaves. It outlined a series of concerns. Incident reports filed outside protocol. Medication discrepancy documentation submitted without supervisor approval. A formal complaint from 2 attending physicians regarding what it called pattern of insubordination and procedural noncompliance. She had 30 days to respond in writing. She could request a review panel. What she could not do, the letter made clear, was return to the trauma unit floor until the matter was resolved. Voss folded her badge into the pocket of her jacket and walked out through the staff exit without stopping at the desk. The thing about those incident reports was that every single one of them was accurate. The first one she filed was 8 months earlier, after a patient presented with a drug interaction that shouldn't have existed given what the chart said he'd been prescribed. The chart, she noticed, had been amended, not flagged as amended, just quietly changed, the original entries overwritten with clean numbers that told a cleaner story. She brought it to her unit supervisor, a man named Clifton who had been at Brampton General for 22 years, and who had the particular exhaustion of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything. He told her she must have misread the original. She had not misread it. She had a memory for numbers the way other people have. A memory for faces. Instant, permanent, unreasonable. She remembered the original values the way she remembered every set of vitals she'd ever read. Exactly. She filed the report anyway. The second incident was a patient discharge that shouldn't have happened. A woman in her 60s with elevated cardiac enzymes sent home on a Friday afternoon with a prescription and a follow-up appointment 3 weeks out. The woman returned by ambulance 48 hours later. She survived, but barely. The attending on call that Friday was Dr. Beaumont. Not Francois Beaumont. A different Beaumont, first name Gerald. A man who drove a car that cost more than most people's annual salary and who had been on staff at Brampton General for 11 years without a single formal complaint on his record, which Voss had come to understand was not the same thing as never having made a mistake. She filed that report too. By the time she filed the fourth one, she understood what she was doing. She wasn't reporting errors, she was documenting a pattern. And patterns, in her experience, always belonged to something larger than themselves. She grew up in Timmins, in northern Ontario, the second of 3 kids, in a house where her father worked at the mine and her mother worked at the school board. And nobody talked much about feelings, but everybody showed up when it mattered. She joined the Canadian Forces at 20, combat medic stream, because she was good with her hands and couldn't stand the idea of sitting still. She did 2 rotations in Kandahar and 1 in Mali. She learned to assess casualties under conditions that had nothing to do with bright lights and sterile fields and the luxury of a second opinion. She learned that the body tells you what it needs if you know how to listen, and that most people don't learn to listen until something forces them to. She got out at 26 with her service record and a set of skills that transferred cleanly into nursing and a habit of noticing things that didn't add up, that she had never quite been able to turn off. She didn't talk about the service, generally. People either made it into something cinematic, all gravitas and recognition, or they didn't know what to say and got awkward. Either way, it wasn't a conversation she found useful. She'd been Voss in the forces, and she was Voss at Brampton General, and that continuity felt like enough. The incident reports were not about her past. They were about a pattern she could see clearly and couldn't pretend otherwise. During the suspension, she went home to Timmins for a week. Her mother made lake trout and didn't ask questions. Her father asked one question: "Are you all right?" And when she said yes, he nodded and let it be. On the drive back south on the 400, she stopped at a Tim Hortons outside Barrie and sat in the parking lot with a coffee going cold in her hands, and thought about what she actually knew versus what she suspected. What she knew: 4 incident reports, each documenting a discrepancy between what the chart said and what she had observed or recorded herself. 1 amended chart, 2 patients readmitted after early discharge, a pattern of overnight authorizations for medication adjustments that bore Dr. Stardmy, Beaumont's credentials, but that nobody in the unit had ever seen him physically sign off on. What she suspected: the discrepancies were not coincidental. The amended chart was not a clerical correction. The suspension was not about procedural non-compliance. She'd been suspended not because she'd broken protocol. She'd been suspended because she kept filing reports that pointed at something, and someone had decided she needed to stop. She started her car and drove back to Brampton. Her neighbor, a retired RCMP sergeant named Gagnon, who had moved into the building 2 years ago and who played cribbage by himself on his balcony every Sunday, noticed her car in the lot at irregular hours during the suspension and knocked on her door one afternoon with a plate of butter tarts, in the directness of a man who had spent 30 years deciding when to ask questions. He said, "You look like someone with a problem they haven't figured out how to frame yet." She said, "I might have stumbled into something at work." He put the butter tarts on the counter and sat down. "How big is something?" She told him. Not everything. Not the Kandahar years, not the things she'd noticed about the medication authorization timestamps, but enough. Enough for him to sit with his hands folded on his kitchen table and be quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been documenting this alone?" She said she had. He said, "You need someone who can receive what you're building. Not just read it. Receive it. Officially." She knew what he meant. She'd been building a case the way she'd been trained to build anything: methodical, documented, complete. But a case without a destination was just a file. She went back through everything. Not the copies she'd submitted to Clifton. Those were gone, either filed into a drawer or destroyed. She had no way to know. But she'd kept her own, photographed on her phone the night she wrote each one, cross-referenced with her personal log, the handwritten notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her jacket and that she'd started carrying as a habit in Kandahar when she learned that memory, however good, was not the same as a record. The medication authorization pattern went back 14 months. She could see it clearly now that she laid everything out on her kitchen table, a cluster of overnight adjustments, almost always weekends, almost always for patients in a specific wing of the hospital, the cardiac step-down unit. The authorizations were signed with Beaumont's credentials, but the timestamps were wrong. Beaumont worked days. He had a standing golf commitment every Saturday morning that Voss knew about because the entire trauma unit knew about it, the way you know the background noise of any place you spend enough time. She photographed every page. She organized the files by date, by patient unit, by the credential ID attached to each authorization. Then she cross-referenced them against the hospital's published on-call schedule, which was posted on the intranet, and which she had screenshotted at the end of every week for 8 months, out of a habit she hadn't consciously decided to form. Beaumont's name appeared on the call schedule on a total of 3 weekend nights in the period covered by the authorizations. His credentials appeared on 31. Gagnon connected her with a woman named Brenda Okafor, a health sector investigator with the Ontario Ministry of Health's Compliance Office, who drove up from Toronto and met Voss at a coffee shop in downtown Brampton on a Wednesday afternoon in February, with the particular economy of movement of someone who'd done this kind of meeting many times. Okafor looked at the documentation for 45 minutes without speaking. Then she looked at Voss over the top of her reading glasses and said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" Voss said, "The pattern took me about a week to see. The documentation took 8 months. Okafor said, "The suspension, do you have the letter?" Voss put it on the table. Okafor read it, folded it, handed it back, said, "They'll tell you this is a performance issue. That's standard. Don't respond to the review panel request yet." Voss nodded. Okafor said, "I need to ask you something. Not about the documents." She paused. "You held on to this for 8 months. Filed 4 reports that you knew were going to go nowhere. Kept photographing your own work. Why didn't you go to the media or a union rep?" Voss thought about it honestly. Then she said, "Because I wanted the record to be clean. If it goes through a journalist, it becomes a story. If it goes through a union, it becomes a grievance. I wanted it to be evidence." Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you develop that instinct?" And Voss told her. Okafor didn't react the way most people did. She didn't reframe the conversation or get solemn about it. She just nodded once and said, "That explains the documentation discipline." She said she'd be in touch within 2 weeks. She was in touch in 4 days. The call came at 6:30 in the morning while Voss was running the trail behind her building, the February cold sharp enough to make her eyes water. She slowed to a walk and answered. Okafor said, "We've been watching Brampton General for 7 months. Different entry point. A whistleblower in the pharmacy supply chain who went quiet in November. Your documentation fills a gap we couldn't close on our own." Voss kept walking. The trail was empty. A crow called somewhere in the tree line. She said, "Fills? How?" Okafor said, "The credential misuse you documented connects to a billing pattern. Procedures authorized under physician's credentials that either weren't performed or were performed at a different billing tier. The cardiac step-down unit is the center of it. Has been for at least 2 years." Voss stopped walking. She said, "How many patients?" There was a pause on the line. Okafor said, "We don't have a complete number yet. That's part of what we're still building." Voss stood in the cold and looked at the bare trees and thought about the woman in her 60s with elevated cardiac enzymes who had gone home on a Friday afternoon and come back by ambulance 2 days later. She said, "What do you need from me?" What they needed was testimony, not just the documents. Those were already in Okafor's hands, already being processed through the formal intake, but testimony that could speak to what the documents couldn't, what it looked and felt like from inside the unit, how the pattern of behavior matched what she had observed in real time, what Clifton had said when she brought the first report to him, what the culture of the trauma unit communicated about what was tolerated and what was not. There was also a second thing. Okafor said it carefully. She said, "There's a physician on staff who we believe is cooperating with the compliance office voluntarily. We need someone who can be present at a meeting we're arranging, not officially, not visibly, to assess whether what he tells us is consistent with what the documentation shows. Someone who knows the unit, someone who'll know if he's leaving something out." Voss said, "You're asking me to sit in on an interrogation." Okafor said, "I'm asking you to sit in an adjacent room with a monitor and tell me afterward if anything he says doesn't line up." Voss said, "That's an interrogation." Okafor said, "You're not wrong." The meeting was held in a government office building in Mississauga 3 weeks later, in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. Voss sat in the adjacent room with a junior compliance officer named Park, who had the particular stillness of someone who had trained themselves to be forgettable, and watched the monitor. The physician on the other side of the wall was Dr. Leland Marsh, an internist who had been at Brampton General for 6 years and who Voss had worked alongside perhaps a dozen times in the trauma unit. She had thought of him as decent, not exceptional, not particularly memorable, but a man who did his work carefully and treated the nursing staff with basic courtesy, which at Brampton General put him in the upper tier. He was visibly nervous. He held a cup of coffee with both hands and set it down without drinking from it. He answered Okafor's questions in full sentences, careful sentences, the kind that arrive already edited. He described the credential authorization system, the way the digital sign-off process had been structured at Brampton General, the gaps in the audit trail that he said he'd raised with administration twice and been told were a legacy software issue that would be addressed in the next system upgrade. He described being asked by a senior administrator, a man named Whitcomb, to retroactively authorize 2 sets of weekend adjustments for patients he had not personally seen. He said he'd refused. He said he'd been told it was a formality. He said he didn't know what Whitcomb had done after that. Voss watched his hands. She watched the way he oriented his body toward the door at irregular intervals, not consistently, which would be anxiety, but in a pattern, which was something else. She watched the way his voice dropped on the name Whitcomb, not from emotion, but from calculation. The way people lower their voice around a word they've decided is dangerous. When the session was over, Park turned to her and said, "Well?" Voss said, "He's telling the truth about what he did and didn't do. He's not telling you everything he knows about Whitcomb." Park said, "You're confident about that?" Voss said, "Yes." Park wrote something down. The investigation took another 4 months. Voss was not kept fully informed. That wasn't the arrangement. But Okafor called her periodically with questions, sometimes small ones that Voss didn't always understand the purpose of until she thought about them later and saw where they fit in the larger structure. During those months, she worked at a walk-in clinic in Etobicoke, evenings and weekends, which paid less and was quieter, and involved mostly strep throats and sports injuries, and the occasional patient who came in for something routine and turned out to have something else entirely. She found she didn't mind the pace. She slept better than she had in years. Her suspension remained officially in place. She had not responded to the review panel request, as Okafor had advised. The letter from Brampton General's HR department sat in a folder in her kitchen drawer, next to the original letter from Dr. Costa, Hargreaves and Okafor's business card, and a single page of handwritten notes from her first conversation with Gagnon. She ran every morning. She had dinner with her neighbor every second Sunday. She called her mother on Saturdays. She did not tell anyone else what was happening. She had learned over years and in circumstances considerably louder than this one, that the moment you involve more people in a thing you're still building, the thing starts to become about the people instead of about itself. On a Thursday in June, Okafor called and said, "The charges have been approved. We're announcing Monday." Voss was at the clinic. She stepped into the hallway and said, "Whitcomb?" Okafor said, "Whitcomb and 2 others. The credential fraud goes back further than your documentation, closer to 4 years. The billing irregularities are significant. Patient harm is part of it." Voss leaned against the wall. A child ran past in the waiting room, trailing a parent. She said, "The woman with the cardiac enzymes. From the Friday discharge." Okafor said, "I know the case you mean. She's been identified in the patient review. Her family has been notified." Voss didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "And Brampton General?" Okafor said, "There will be a formal review of administration and governance structure. Your suspension will be formally vacated as part of the process. That should come to you in writing within the week." Voss said, "That's not what I was asking." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. The answer is that the institution will be investigated, required to implement oversight changes, and monitored. Whether that constitutes justice depends on who you ask." Voss thought about Clifton, 22 years on the job, and that particular exhausted look. She thought about the residents who had winced when the bone came through the skin. She thought about the nurses who had worked that unit for a decade and probably known something was wrong, and had known better than to say so. She said, "I know who I'd ask." Okafor said, "I know you do." The letter arrived on a Wednesday 12 days later. It was brief, formal language, official letterhead, informing her that the suspension was vacated with no findings against her, and that she was eligible to return to her position in the trauma unit effective immediately. She folded it the same way she'd folded the first one. Put it in the same kitchen drawer. She didn't go back to the trauma unit. She had already accepted a position at a different hospital, a larger regional center 40 minutes away, where a unit director named Chow had called her after hearing about the case through channels Voss didn't ask about, and had offered her a role on a patient safety review committee in addition to her floor responsibilities. Chow had said on that call, "I've read your incident reports. All of them. You know what they read like?" Voss had said she wasn't sure. Chow had said, "They read like someone who learned to write under pressure. Someone who knew the report might be the only record that survived." Voss had not answered right away. Then she'd said, "Yes, that's exactly right." The first shift at the new hospital was a Tuesday in August, the air outside thick and warm the way southern Ontario gets in the summer. She changed in the staff room, clipped her badge to her scrubs, found the trauma unit orientation package in her locker. A resident stopped her in the hallway, young, early 30s, already moving with the particular efficiency of someone who'd trained themselves to never look uncertain. He was holding a chart and he said, "Are you Voss? The new trauma nurse?" She said she was. He said, "Good, we've got a bleed in Bay 2, and the attending's still 3 minutes out." She was already moving. Her hands, as always, were perfectly still. I think about the moment Claire Voss folded that first letter and put it in her back pocket. No dramatic reaction. No tears in the change room. Just a woman who had been trained, in circumstances far harder than a hospital hallway, to absorb what was happening and decide what to do next. That's the part that stays with me. There's a version of this story where Voss walks out of Brampton General and doesn't look back. Files for wrongful dismissal. Takes the settlement. Moves on. Nobody would have blamed her. The system had made it very clear in the quiet, institutional language of formal letters and vacated incident reports that speaking up had a cost, and that cost would be applied to her personally. Most people, faced with that arithmetic, do the reasonable thing. She didn't do the reasonable thing. But I don't think it was stubbornness exactly. I think it was something more precise than that. She knew what she had seen. And she understood, because of where she'd come from, because of what she'd done before anyone at that hospital knew her name, that knowing something and having a record of it are not the same thing. So she built the record, 8 months of photographs, cross-references, timestamps, handwritten notes in the inside pocket of her jacket. Not because she was certain it would matter. Because she understood that if it was ever going to matter, the record had to be clean. That's what integrity actually looks like in practice, I think. Not the dramatic version. Not the person who stands up in the meeting and says the thing nobody wants to hear. The quieter version. The person who photographs their own work at the end of every shift, just in case. The person who keeps the notebook because memory, however good, is not evidence. And then there's the intelligence of it, the way she saw the pattern before she understood what it meant. 14 months of authorization timestamps, a golf commitment, a call schedule posted on an intranet that she'd been screenshotting weekly out of a habit she hadn't consciously decided to form. She wasn't looking for wrongdoing when she started. She was just someone who noticed when numbers didn't add up, and who had enough respect for that feeling to follow it somewhere. That's a kind of clear-sightedness that doesn't arrive automatically. It gets built. Through training, through experience, through whatever it was that happened in Kandahar and Mali that Voss didn't talk about in polite company, the capacity to look at a situation without the distortion of wanting it to be something other than what it is. And then the endurance of it. 4 reports that went nowhere. A suspension that was designed to be humiliating. Months of working evenings at a walk-in clinic, while an investigation she couldn't fully see moved at its own pace, running the trail behind her building in February cold, answering calls at 6:30 in the morning, holding what she knew carefully enough that it stayed usable. She didn't burn it down in a moment of righteous anger. She kept it intact until someone could receive it properly. The woman with the elevated cardiac enzymes sent home on a Friday afternoon. That patient got named in a formal review because Voss had the discipline to document, the clarity to see what the documentation meant, and the steadiness to carry it somewhere it could do something real. That's the full picture, I think. Not one of those qualities alone. All 3 of them together, over time.